Buttons, 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 buttons. When I was little, I had an issue with buttons. There weren't any personal computers to be had, so any buttons that were around were in short supply, and if I saw them, I took every opportunity to push them. Unfortunately, most of the buttons that were around were connected to some kind of an emergency mechanism, which means I got into a lot of trouble when I was a kid. This keen interest in pushing buttons took a different direction, however. When I was out with my mother one day, I wasn't exactly sure if it was a bowling alley or a flea market, but it was one of those places that was big, kind of white, and had a lot of echoey noises to it. Anyway, I was over in this little gap where one of those stupid robotic clowns was waving back and forth, and I happened to notice this large white machine. This large white machine had a blinking little red candy-like button. I wanted to push it. I pushed it, and I started hearing noises. I couldn't see what the hell was going on because it was way up high, but I saw that there were some flashing lights, and it made an interesting noise every time I pushed the button on the side and twisted the handles back and forth. This started my unhealthy obsession with video arcades. Arcades as I knew them have been dead for a very long time. However, that sweet, sweet ambiance will forever be etched into my mind. Rows upon rows of glowing cabinets putting off a delightful aroma of ionized ozone, while 1,000,001 familiar blips and bleeps advertised all around you that there was fun and excitement to be had at the drop of a mere quarter. To my eyes, what laid before me was a beautiful utopia, a promise of the future that brought more excitement than any amusement park ever could. To this day, the memory of the rare occasions where I got to stand all by myself, alone, in one of these shrines still gives me goosebumps. Now, it must be made known that not everything in an arcade would catch my attention. Shooting galleries were fun, but they were a little passé, and for some reason I could never quite hit anything on the target, so I usually ended up with no show for the quarters I spent. Skee-ball was okay, but it lacked flashiness and style. I especially lost interest in it when it turned out that my younger brother was better at it than me. Nothing says shame like getting owned at skee-ball by a 2-year-old. As far as the rest of the ticket-winning games were concerned, Whack-A-Mole gave me a complex because I could swear those little bastards were laughing at me, and the rest of the stuff just seemed to play off of people's impulse to gamble, which is never a healthy thing, to say nothing for the ever-increasing ticket inflation problem. Pinball was amazing, but it was something that I more or less had to grow into, not only because I couldn't see exactly what was going on in the entire board due to my size, but also because it requires a certain level of post-pubescent sophistication to truly understand the art. So this brings us back to the subject of the video games and their wonderful tasty buttons. In the early days, I was a fan of pretty much everything, from the high-end graphics of Donkey Kong and Pac-Man, all the way back to the stuff that required decals stuck to the screen to signify clouds, colors, and anything else that could not be represented through the primitive pixels of the time.
Well, yeah, just like real driving.
As I grew older, say about 6 or 7, my taste became more refined and I started getting more picky and choosy about exactly which buttons I was pressing. At this time, my parents started occasionally taking me to what I consider to be the greatest arcade on the planet, Malibu Castle Golf and Games in San Antonio, Texas. It's a nice place to visit, but you don't want to live there. Anyway, at this time, my interest was primarily held by 3 particular games: Crossbow, Star Wars, and Dragon's Lair. Maybe not necessarily in that order, that part of my memory is a little blurry, but I can tell you exactly where I was when I first ran into each of these 3 games. We'll start with Crossbow. Now, yes, I know that I've already stated that I wasn't entirely fond of shooting galleries, but there was a big difference here. 1, you could actually see where your shots were landing. 2, there was a great assortment of wild environments. And 3, there is something to be said for any game that has a full-size, heavy-ass, iron and wood medieval instrument of death bolted to the front of it. I first discovered this masterpiece at the Malibu Castle, which only seemed logical given the general theme of the place. The way I saw it, this game was the main reason to come here, despite the fact that I had a great deal of difficulty aiming since this thing was set unusually high up and the local arcades hadn't quite gotten it into their heads to start supplying the wee ones with those helpful little wooden step stools that we've all come to know so well as the greatest breaker of toes this side of the Pecos. The Exidy Company had made a few other shooter games, but Cheyenne just kind of reminded me of those boring, repetitive Wild West galleries, and their last attempt, Chiller, just kind of made me sick to my stomach. Besides, Crossbow had such an amazing cast of characters. There was Mustached Robin Hood Knockoff, Blonde in Hot Red, Gimli Wannabe, Crazy Cat Lady, Pointy Hat Cave Wizard, and Black Guy in His Underwear. Ah, what a great game, right down to the final boss being a head that looked like a leftover from the mid-70s rock revolution. And speaking of the mid-70s, that brings us to our next game, Star Wars. I first found this one at a hot dog eatery at a strip mall down the street from where my dad worked. Now, I don't know about all of you out there, but when I was a kid, I completely shunned G.I. Joe in favor of my Star Wars toys. Was I a fan? Well, I was able to recite the entire first movie from beginning to end before I was able to learn to read or write, so I guess at the time, yes. Having heard me say this, you can probably imagine my excitement when I first found this game. I mean, yes, all the graphics were pretty much just wireframes, but to a small child, that, combined with the fact that it was actually playing the real theme music and had actual recordings of Luke, R2, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, or at least awkward digital copies of them, regardless, this game rocked.
Bridge 5, I'm going in.
Now, escapism runs in my family, and I love good theming, so I had nothing but love for the cabinet of this thing. The further I leaned into it, the more it felt like I was in an actual cockpit of an X-Wing fighter, and the less I had contact with reality. Hell, there were several occasions where I was known to just close my eyes and start trying to use the Force in order to play. Yeah, that gave everybody else a pretty good laugh, but I thought I was doing pretty good. And so onward to the third and I suppose most striking game that I ever played, Dragon's Lair. I'm sure we all remember just what kind of a big deal this was. There were no square pixelated sprites here. This was full-on, richly colored, living animation that you could frickin' control. Well, I mean, sort of control. The visuals were created by Don Bluth, a true maniac of the animation industry, who showed us that even the most valiant knight was usually prone to screaming like a little girl. I first discovered this game at a local bowling alley where my mother had set me up to take part in a league that I lost interest in after about 3 frames. After that, I kept finding excuses just to wander off so I could go back into the game room and watch that intro screen over and over. Oh, and in case you're wondering, I did not care for Space Ace. Dragon's Lair was all about nervous anticipation, especially since when you hit the button or joystick, the screen would usually go black for a second or two before you knew whether or not you had survived the perils that you had a moment ago been gawking at. But there were very few things more satisfying than hearing that triumphant little fanfare at the end signifying that you had completed another level. Now, the tension I just spoke of was always a little bit higher with me when playing any arcade games because I always had a very limited bank with which to play them. The very sad and real fact was, despite how much I loved arcade games, I was notoriously bad at them, and was lucky to make $1's worth of quarters last 3 minutes, if that. This of course frustrated the hell out of my poor father, who had been raised sharply with the understanding that if something couldn't sustain you or serve you for 10 years or more, it wasn't worth spending your money on. This was primarily, of course, why I spent most of my childhood observing games rather than playing them. Seems everywhere we went there was a machine that I wanted to play, and this drove my parents nuts. The local cinema had a Tron machine in the lobby, and I didn't so much mind not having the money to play this one because I just like basking in its cool neon glow and staring into that crazy window with the computer landscape behind it. And Tempest I had no particular interest in since every 2-bit game room in America seemed to have it. A game is just no fun when it's that common. Then of course there was Wizard of War, which was just fun to hang around so you could occasionally hear it talk in that Stephen Hawking style voice. As time progressed, graphics got better and I was seeing games more and more sparsely. I found Gauntlet at a KOA campground and swore up and down at the time that it was the greatest game triumph ever. Now I can't stand to sit still for more than 30 seconds of it. There was Indiana Jones over at the local gas station, and then that crazy combo of Gauntlet and Indy at that bowling alley in Florida. Then I started seeing airbrushed colors, side-scrolling multiplayer fighting, and so on and so on. If you follow me, things just seemed to get less and less interesting, like the better the look of the games got, the less fun they were to play, with a few minor exceptions. These days, arcade games seem to do nothing more than loudly emulate real life as closely as humanly possible. Even the fantasy stuff just seems overly complicated and too realistic in my eyes. And those true-to-life, gone in 60 seconds style driving simulators? I have a car. I'll abuse it like that when I'm good and ready. I feel the same way about games like Guitar Hero. If there's really that much work involved, why not just learn to play a real guitar? And have you seen this thing yet? Still, I do see the charm of the performance aspect of these things. I mean, who doesn't want to feel big, popular, famous, and amazing for even just a few minutes? It's just not my thing. Most folks in my gaming generation lost interest in arcades around the same time anyway. Between the creation of the PlayStation and the N64, the games you could play free at home were actually getting better than the stuff you had to pay a quarter for. The ambiance had faded long ago as well. The magic of the old arcades wasn't in real-time combat, fast steps, or how many headshots you could pull off. It was the very basic excitement of color, sounds, and scores. The game didn't have to make much sense, just enough for your imagination to take over, and then your mind could cook up whatever you wanted to believe. In this day and age, anyone with high-tech tools or the right software can create a realistic, fully rendered ROM. But back then, it was programmers building from scratch, taking very limited tools and struggling imaginatively to make something worth looking at. This love, care, and effort shined through and gave a real soul to these games that modern technology will, in all likelihood, never be able to duplicate. Like the old Epcot Center or Buck Rogers, a future of the past, a sweet vision of what was new and exciting. I pray that its memory never leaves my mind, exactly how it was, and exactly how it felt.